Pranam, Jai Jinendra. We'll start with prayers as usual. Let me just first share my slides. Namo Orientanam, Namo Sittanam, Namo Ayriyanam, Namo Jayanam, Namo Lve Sabba Sahunam. Eso Panchanamukaro Sabba Pava Panasanam, Mangalanancha Sabbe Simpadmam Havai Mangalam. Namo Orientanam, Namo Sittanam, Namo Ayriyanam, Namo Jayanam, Namo Lve Sabba Sahunam. Eso Panchanamukaro Sabba Pava Panasanam, Mangalanancha Sabbe Simpadmam Havai Mangalam. Namo Orientanam, Namo Siddhanam, Namo Ayariyanam, Namo Ujjayanam, Namo Loe Sabba Sahunam. Eso Panchanamukaro Sabba Pava Panasanam, Mangalanancha Sabbe Simpadmam Havai Mangalam. Veera Sarasura, Surendra Mahito, Viramudda Sansrita, Virana Bhiyata, Swakarmani Chayo, Viraya Nityam Nama, Vira Tirthamidam Prodamatalam, Virashaghoram Tapo, Vire Sri Druti Kirtikanti Nichaya, Sri Virabhadram Disa. अंगूठे अमृतवसे लपति तना भंडार श्री गुरु गौतम समरिये मनवांछित फलदातार. We'll start with Paresar Sajai, reciting it as usual, and then we'll carry on with our topic. I'll come to the details after we have recited the Sajai. पर हे सर बाहुबली अभय कुमारो अढंडन कुमारो सिरियोनियाऊ तोय मुत्तो नागदत्तो मेज थुली बद्धो वैर ऋषि नंदी सेण सिंह गिरी कई वन्नो सुकोसल पुंडरी केसी करकंडु हल विहल सुदंसण साल महासाल साली बद्दो पद्दो दसन बद्दो पसन चंदो अजस बद्दो जम्बु पहु वंक चूलो गई सुकुमालो वंति सुकुमालो दनो इलाई पुत्तो चिलाई पुत्तो बाहुमुनि अजगिरि अजरखिय अज सुहति उदय गो मणगो कालेश्वरी शंभो पज्जुनो मूलदेवो प्रभावो वीणु कुमारो अद कुमारो दट पहाड़ी सिजन से कुरगड्डू सिजन भव मेह कुमारो एमाई महासत्ता दिंतु सोम गुणगणे हिम संजुता जयसिम नाम गहणे पाप बंदा विलेम जंती सुलसा चंदन बाला मनोरमा मयण रे हदमयंती नमया सुंदरी सिया नंदा वद्दा सुभद्दाय राय मेरी सिदता पौमावई अंजना श्री देवी जिठ्ठ सुजिठ मिगावई पपावई चलना देवी बम्बी सुंदरी रूपिणी रेवई कुंती शिवा जयंतिया देवई दोई धारिणी कलावई पुफुचुलाय पौमावई गौरी गांधारी लक्ष्मणा सुसीमाय जम्बुवई सच बामा रूपिणी हठ महिषियो चखाय चखदीना भूत चे भूब दीनाय शीणा वीणा रेणा भयणीय थुली पद्दस इच्छाई महासयो जयंती अकलंक सील कलियाओ अजबी अज जासिम जस पड़ होती होने सयले. I won't go into all these details today. So last week we heard the uh, story about Sri Kalikacharya, one of the great acharyas. As I mentioned last time, the texts describe three different Kalikacharyas, and we recited the story of one of them, which is the most famous. There are two other very interesting uh, details and reference to two other Kalikacharyas. We'll try and cover one of them today, and the last story regarding Kalikacharya has some relevance to the forthcoming Paryushan festival. So maybe when we start our next Tuesday before Paryushan, the class will focus partly on Paryushan, and at that time I will try and complete the story of the third Kalikacharya. If we have time, then I'll start that particular story as well. As we heard last time, the story of Kalikacharya that we heard last week was with reference to an Acharya Bhagwant who had to take up arms and to defend the honor of Sadhviji, who happened to be his sister, and takes on the task of defeating a king who had abducted the Sadhuji Maharaj, his sister. The Acharya had to do that as an exception because there was no other way to defend the Sadhuji Maharaj, and it was not possible to gain the support of other kings or somebody to take on that task for him. So he gave up his robes as a monk temporarily, took up arms, and organized with other kings an army and took on this king who had abducted the Sadhuji Maharaj, and he succeeds in his task and then hands over the kingdoms back to the kings who had supported him and does his prayaschit for having deviated from the path and having taken up arms, which was against the vows that he had first taken, takes his penance for that, retakes his vows, and carries on leading his life as a monk. So that was the first Kalikacharya's story that we heard about. Today, we are going to hear the story of another Kalikacharya, which is also very interesting. And at the end of today's story, I'm going to uh, ask a few questions of certain things that I think we should all think about. And maybe a lot of you will find that interesting. This is a story uh, set in a city-state of Turmani, where there's a king called Jitsatru. Kalik was a Brahmin in the city, and he had a nephew, his sister's son, called Dutt. Kalik became detached from worldly life and took Diksha as a Jain monk, as a Nirgranth. His nephew Dutt, who was very selfish but very clever as well, he got a job in the royal administration and fairly rapidly progressed on to become a minister. Over a period of time, he engineered his position in such a way that he ultimately got rid of the existing king. He ousted him, King Jitsatru, and took over the kingdom, and he became king, and he took on the throne. As a king, that, based on his background and based on his belief, he was very fond of doing yagnas. Yagnas, as you probably know, are sort of sacrificial rituals in front of a fire, and they involve a lot of violence because the innocent animals are sacrificed in this rituals. And at that time, those things were happening. But Dutt was very fond of such yagnas. Once Kalikacharya, the monk Kalik, who had become an acharya, he came back to this city. Dutt went to see his acharya, and knowing that he was a very learned and knowledgeable person, probably with extrasensory knowledge, and asked him about the fruits of doing yagnas. He was under the impression that a yagna is an activity that would earn a lot of punya, that would give him a lot of uh, good things in his future lives. And he wanted the authentication of his activities in yagnas from a great acharya, his mama, who was visiting the city. Kalikacharya very clearly told him that the fruit of violent activity, like yagnas, was narak, hell, meaning that if he was killing innocent animals, then there was no other place, but he would end up in hell. Dutt was obviously quite upset and would not accept this. And he tries very hard to argue this with Kalikacharya. Says, oh, that's not true. I've come to believe that the doing yagnas is a activity of earning good merit, of punya activity, and that you are wrong. Kalikacharya was quite firm and said that that is what I see in my gnan, in my knowledge, and that is what the Shastras say. And he said, for you in particular, he elaborated and said that because of the violence and as a result, he would go to hell in his next life. And he said that that is your future. Not only that, that will happen very shortly, within a few days. And he says, as further evidence of the sequence of events, on the seventh day from today, you would get feces in your mouth, meaning that something from outside would drop into your mouth, you would get feces, and soon afterwards, you will die. And your next life is going to be in hell. He was very angry at this statement. Dutt was obviously very upset and thought that he would kill Kalikacharya. Kalikacharya was firm and he stood firm in spite of the threats that he received from Dutt. Dutt thought that Kalikacharya is not going away anywhere because he decides to keep him captive and says, I will wait until the 7 days are over and then I will decide what to do with Kalikacharya. To be safe and to sort of not tempt fate, he thought that he would be safe inside his palace, and he retires to his palace and stays there for 6 days continuously, thinking that he's completely safe from anything else, that he's got a controlled environment in the palace, and that he is safe from any kind of violent attack on him or anything that might kill him. However, as fate would have it, he got confused about the days, and thinking that he had already completed 7 days in his palace, he comes out on day 7 thinking that this was actually day 8. And he is very happy that he has escaped the death sentence that Kalikacharya had predicted, that he would die on that day. And he decides to get out of the palace, put on his very nice clothes, and go out into the city so that he could express his happiness. He got confused about the days and came out of the palace on day 7, thinking it was day 8. As was the norm in those cities at the time, the city streets were cleaned thoroughly every few days, and this was the day when the cleaners were actually cleaning the city and refreshing the pavements and making sure that everything was clean and smelled nice. The workers were laying flowers on the streets after they had cleaned that. However, one of the workers, while he was busy with this work of cleaning and laying the flowers, he was actually a mali. A mali is a flower seller or a flower a flower farmer who was bringing all the flowers to the city, as was his duty, to decorate the streets. Because he was quite busy and he thought he would not have time to go to pass stools because he had a sudden urge, he decides to very quickly, when nobody is looking, relieve himself on the street. He thought that there wouldn't be any problem, and he does that very quickly and covers that pot of that pile of his feces with lots of flowers and just carries on with his task. So all that was seen on the street were flowers everywhere, and this pile of feces was covered by flowers like a lot of other piles of flowers, so nobody really knew. Dutt had dressed up in full regalia and was riding his horse with pride. His horse stepped on this particular pile of flowers, underneath which there were lots of feces, and a small amount of the feces flew because as the horse was riding, the feces flew up in the air and landed in his mouth. So King Dutt had probably had his mouth open for a minute or two, and the feces fell into his mouth. And you can imagine what kind of shock the king would have had. He was quite dejected, returned to his palace because the first part of Acharya's prediction had come true. I'm going to now recite the rest of the story because I've not had time to complete the slides for this. But basically, if you remember, at the beginning, we said that Dutt had become a king by ousting the existing king who was ruling. The existing king was Jitsatru, and he was very good. Dutt, on the other hand, was not very popular. One, because he had been very deceitful and he had contrived the way he managed his position as a minister to get into a state where he could actually get rid of the king. The king had a lot of loyal subjects in the city, and he had also hidden lots of his men around the city who were constantly watching for an opportunity. On this particular day, because the king was out, he's probably not as protected as he would normally have. Some of the men from the former king's loyal forces captured Dutt and take him to where the others were, and one of the soldiers of the previous king kills Dutt on this day. So Dutt has now died, and his soul is born again in the seventh hell. It says here that after he died, he went to Satminak, that's the seventh hell. The king, the former king Jitsatru, came back to the throne. Now, there are a few questions. One, why this particular Kalikacharya is remembered here. This story is in itself quite interesting, but it may throw a few questions that some of you may have already been thinking about. Let me start with something very basic. How much do you know about the science of predictions? I mean, Kalikacharya in this instance would have probably used, because of the detail with which he predicted that on the seventh day you will have feces in your mouth and you will die and you will be going to hell after that. Your soul is going to hell after that in your next life, was likely to be using extra sensory knowledge like either Audignan, Manparivgnan, or even greater. I don't know. The details are not in the text that I have read. They're probably there somewhere, and some other more learned people, Acharya Bhagwans, may know the answer to this. But even without extrasensory superior knowledge, there are indications. If you read some of the stories in Kathanu Yoga and some of the Shastras, which say that a lot can be predicted from some very basic observations and the use of Jyotish mathematics. And the whole science is called Samudrik Shastra. There is a short chapter or a short reference to Samudrik Shastra in Kalp Sutra, which will be reciting during Paryushan. We don't manage to recite the whole of it, but this particular part may come in some of the recitation. If you are attending, you might find that interesting as well. But there are lots of different angles that people who specialize, or great acharyas or pandits who specialize in the predictive sciences, use to predict lots of things. The different tools that are used, Jyotish, you probably all have heard of, and Jain Jyotish Shastra is also very detailed, and there are some very expert practitioners of that science around. Samudrik Shastra includes the science of prediction through the study of the person's body's structure, including the lines in the hands. But there are also lots of other lakshanas or different signs which tell you a lot about the kind of person and the kind of life that they might lead and particular events that they might enjoy or suffer from in the future. Then there is something called Nimit Shastra. Nimit Shastra is about reading the signs around you, and some of that also includes the sounds of birds and animals in the immediate vicinity of where a person is. So this whole sort of predictive sciences are called Samudrik Shastra and Jyotish. And there are lots of references about this. A lot of you may find this difficult to believe and digest, but there are very good examples of how successful some of the practitioners in these sciences are. Our Acharya Bhagwans, Guru Maharaj, don't generally enter into discussions about this, and they'll only mention something when it is of particular relevance to somebody, to either educate the person themselves, help them change the direction of their thoughts, behavior, to guide them to change their life course, or sometimes when there is a greater good, as in this particular instance of making it known to people of the sins that are committed in the name of dharma, like doing yagnas, which are violent. So animal sacrifice that used to be practiced was something that the Acharya Bhagwant Kalikacharya was particularly trying to bring forth to the public, that this is not a, a dharmic activity, that this involves a lot of pap, it involves killing a lot of innocent animals, and this wouldn't be recommended in any religion. But somehow things got twisted, and that is another story of how this practice of animal sacrifice actually came about. And maybe sometime in the future we will consider that as well. But this is not, there was quite a long time before this particular incident happened. Okay. So I'll end my explanation there. The other possible question that you might have about this particular incident is how circumstances actually direct people's lives, and the choices that are made by certain people, and what sort of things actually end up with making us choose certain paths which ultimately lead to our ruin. As in this particular story, Dutt is the son of a simple Brahmin. He, however, has very high ambitions. He is clever, so he manages to get a job in the administration and slowly engineers it so that he comes very close to the king, becomes a minister, becomes well respected, and gradually worms his way into all kinds of things. I mean, the detail is not here, but one can imagine of what could have happened that led him to actually overthrow the king and become the king himself of this small city state, what of city state. And the sense of pride in his achievement, not thinking that whatever he did wasn't a nice thing to do or wasn't the best thing to do, his belief that he could actually earn good merit for his future lives by performing yagnas, forgetting about everything else that he had done. That particular belief that carried on in his mind, that led him to behave in the way that he did, is also another lesson for us to think about as to that is convinced in his pride that whatever he is doing is for his best, even though he has the belief that was very standard in those times, that there is life after that, that you go, your soul is separate from your body, that once you die, you go to somewhere else, and that whatever good deeds that you have done in this life carry forward. So the understanding that in this life you prepare for the next as well was fairly commonly accepted by all people in those times. And we are talking about Bharat, India at that time, because all the religions propound that principle that you reap the benefits of your own karmas, that you, if you've done something good, you will reap the benefits of that. If you've done something bad, you will reap the punishment for that. So all those beliefs were held by everybody. In spite of that, that whatever you did was not forgotten. Whatever you did in this life would come back to reward you or bite you in the future. People still take a path that would lead them to actually get into a very negative place in the future. The relevance of this story is for us to reflect that the fault with what Dutt was thinking was, what do you think? Fill in the blank. He wasn't of the mindset which said that whatever you do in this life doesn't matter because nothing comes back to bite you. Everything ends at the end of this life, and that's the end of your future. You are just a temporary construct of matter, and you're born and you die, and there is nothing beyond that. You didn't come from anywhere, you're not going anywhere. He had that belief that he was going somewhere after this life, and that he would reap the benefits of all the good that he did. And he had a firm belief that yagnas were good because that was what he was taught. So, where is the fallacy here? Why was his thinking wrong? And why did he end up with, I mean, doing violence is the result of his belief, but how did he come to believe that violence would beget good karmas for him? At the core of this belief, what are the other fallacies that this particular mindset is holding? So I'm trying to see if we can explore that. Anybody wants to volunteer? Is my question clear? Are there any other comments that anybody wants to make about this story? I'm going to stop sharing the slides now. So nobody wants to volunteer. Shall I pick somebody from the list? Maltiben and Ashwin Jakaria. Any comments? We got Shelina, we got Surbiben. Surbiben? You can switch on your audio, Surbiben. Anybody else? Bharat Bhai?
Jai Jirendra, Pranam.
Pranam.
I personally believe that he probably doing all these yagnas and doing all these sacrifices. He's probably, he thinks that he's doing punya. I mean, he's doing these sacrifices simply because he he wants to accrue punya. But I mean, that's because he's a Brahmin, and mm, he doesn't have any Jain values, nor does he. I mean, he's probably having a kuguru and having the wrong and following the wrong principles in life, and he's clever, but he's probably not aware of uh, what is hinsa and ahimsa in real terms. In terms of animal sacrifices, even even today, it is prevalent in many parts of India. So, and most of them would be other religions. I'm sure nobody from, I mean, a Jain would not, a real Jain would not do anything of that nature. So I believe he's probably he thinks he's on the right path, and when he's not.
So at the core of this belief, thank you very much, Bharat Bhai. I mean, and you have sort of reiterated the thinking behind his behavior and his conviction that yagnas is good and it's punya. But the core miscalculation or the misconception is that I, as a human being, is different and unique, and I have greater value than animals, my life or my soul. If I sacrifice an animal, then the thought is, or the belief is, that that animal's soul or that animal's life is less valuable and that I have the right to take it. And in taking the life and sacrificing the animal to other gods, so at the core of that, there is also this other belief that sacrificing an animal to the gods that are being worshipped in the yagna, the gods themselves are then granting the punya or granting the good karma. So the belief that the gods are helping me, I am satisfying them because sacrificing something tells them about my devotion, and therefore they will reward me with good in the next life. So the fallacy is that the gods that he is worshipping have the power to actually give him the fruits of good and bad. So at the core of this particular belief is that I am not personally responsible for what happens to me. What happens to me is as a result of the benevolence of different gods that I would please by doing good things that are propagated in our shastras, that this is good. So at the core of this misconception is one, no value for other life, not considering them as equal to us. Number two, that somebody else is responsible for the good and the bad that happens to us. So Kalikacharya is predicting his future and saying that you will end up in hell. So he's a bad person, and he decides that he wants to kill him because he's telling him something that he doesn't want to hear. So at the core of this misconception, even in spite of having this understanding that there is life after death. So for us to actually reflect and contemplate on the different, either big, as in this case, or very small fallacies in our knowledge or in our belief systems that we sometimes hold without really realizing. So the real value of these classes is not just about the story, but what I'm hoping that you do is at the end of this class, you spend the week asking your questions to yourselves and coming back to me or to other knowledgeable people like Bharat Bhai or any other Jayesh Bhai or other people and say, what is behind these stories? Because the stories are short, but the real learning comes from your contemplation of the ins and outs of what they are actually telling us about those characters, but more importantly, about how they reflect on our beliefs, our thoughts, our actions, and how we can learn from them and these stories that we would not repeat those mistakes or learn the good things and make all effort to actually follow in their footsteps. Am I making sense? Because I'm trying to get deeper into the thought processes, because ultimately the value of these classes is how we internalize the understanding and the knowledge and how we then put it into practice. Does that help, or am I making people uncomfortable? Feel free, please. I'm trying to push the boundaries a bit with this class, so help me. Anybody else? Darshana? Sheila Ben, thank you. Darshana, you want to say something? And then I'll call in Sheila Ben.
I was going to say, is there an easier way to explain the story? Because I'm finding it a bit difficult to understand this.
Okay. So a very simple way is that this is a story about a great Acharya who has the knowledge to predict the future. And he comes across this particular nephew of his who has engineered his way into becoming a king and ousted the rightful king and taken over a kingdom. So he has engineered that. And he, in his state as a king, becomes very proud and performs a lot of yajnas. Yajnas are where they sacrifice animals in the fire. And one day he just asks Kalikacharya, who is visiting the city, about what are the fruits of this yagnas and what is his future. He is told that the fruits of such violent yagnas is narak, meaning going to hell in your next life. And he definitely is going to narak in his next life. But to give him a bit more, and says that I'm actually also predicting that 7 days from today, you're going to get some feces in your mouth and you will die soon after. Now, the story is about prediction. In a way, this great Kalikacharya, his knowledge is something that we remember. But behind that, there is also this learning about how these belief systems came about, how somebody who is very clever but ends up with this particular kind of activity, which ultimately results in his dying prematurely and ending up his life uh, going to the seventh hell in his next life. So the story is simple enough. But what is celebrated as part of this for us, our learning, is Kalikacharya, but also the detail behind it. So that is the point of the story. But what I'm trying to explore here is what else do we learn apart from everything that I've spelled out. I'm trying to tease out more learning from this. Sheila,
I think the principle of mithya, that brings out his beliefs as well, that he himself believes that he's doing the right thing, whereas according to our Jain principles, he's doing just the opposite.
exactly. So his mithyatva, meaning wrong belief.
Yeah.
So at the core of this fallacy is not knowing or holding beliefs that actually get you into a muddle, take you to a path that results in your unhappiness, extending your sansar from life after life. Yes,
Yeah.
right. You use the right word, mithyatva, but it's important to understand the meaning behind that. It's not just the word.
Yeah, that's correct.
Good. Yeah.
Thank
Good.
you.
Hopefully that helped a bit, Darshana. Okay.
It did. I just have one question. So you
Yeah.
said it, there's an aspect of making a prediction, but isn't your soul already determined on the karma that you do from your previous life, as opposed to the prediction that someone else can make?
Prediction is based on what is happening. So to term the sum total of this person's karmas. So that person in his knowledge, Kalikacharya is already reading that.
Mm-hmm.
So our futures are based on our previous karmas, but also on the choices that we make in this life. A Tirthankar Bhagwan or a Kevli Bhagwan and all the Siddh Bhagwans in Moksha know everything about the past, present, and future. But things don't happen in vacuum, meaning that whenever there is an event or a circumstance that we experience or something that we experience, that circumstance comes into being as a result of the circumstances. So, for example, it's started raining today. You go out in the cold. You are exposed to the cold. You're not well dressed, And as a result of that, you catch a cold, meaning that you pick up a virus that gives you a sore throat, a headache for a few days. And you are suffering because of that. And our suffering is as a result of a asata vedaniya karma that we would have acquired. So that has come into fruition at that time and is making you suffer. So the soul is suffering as a result of that bad karma that it required some time. Now, it may just end there as a simple cold, but if your bad karma is strong enough, you may end up with pneumonia. You may end up with a severe pneumonia that requires hospitalization. And in winter, it happens that that may be the last illness for a lot of people. It all depends on the sum total of the karmas. But the circumstance that started off that particular incident was your exposure to the cold, you're forgetting to wear warm clothes, or it is possible, and you might blame somebody else, that I came in contact with that person who was coughing away all the time in front of me without using his handkerchief. But that person is also an instrument, is not the actual doer of what your suffering has ended up in. One, we suffer because of our own karmas, but there are agents that make it happen. So this particular karma comes into fruition in the months of winter, say, for example, because that is when it is cold, or in a rainy season. And it comes because on that particular day, you had forgotten your sweater somewhere, or that particular person with a severe or a very, and we saw this all the time during the pandemic, that person was, people were passing on the bugs from one person to another. Some of us suffered a little. Many of us suffered possibly a bit more. Some suffered severely. So the circumstances, so things happen because of dravya, kshetra, bhav, bha, time, and karma. So, but you need instruments. But karmas, if they are strong, will attract the circumstances as well.
I think that helps.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's 9 o'clock. Anybody else? But feel free to ask. And don't hesitate to, because it's interactive. We only learn more by asking ourselves and asking whoever is helping us learn. Okay. All right. I hope that was useful. Next week, we will have something about Paryushan, and in that story as well, I will talk about the third Kalikacharya. And after Paryushan, we'll plan on how we're going to take these classes forward. Thank you all very much for listening. If I've said anything that is against the principles of Jain Dharma and the teachings of our great Jinas and our Guru Maharaj, I ask for forgiveness. जिनाग्ना विरुद्ध कायम पण बोलायो केवायो विचारायो ते सभी हो मनोचन काय करी तस्मिच्छामि दुक्कडम सर्वमंगल मांगल्यम सर्वकल्याण कारणम प्रदानम सर्वधर्माणां जनम जयति शासनम. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ajit Bhai. Pranam.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.